presidential crew. And I thought it appropriate. First of all, I want to thank Rudy. My niece told me about this museum some years back, and I thought, and she suggested that I make a donation to it because I've collected all kinds of good stuff. And when I contacted Rudy and told him about it, he agreed. So I got home and I packed a bunch of stuff and sent it up here. There was one item, however, that I couldn't find. In February 1972, I was walking on the Great Wall of China, and I asked the host, and they agreed, and I picked up a rock from the Great Wall, and I brought it home as a souvenir. The problem is, I can't find it. So it's in a safe place. But I started thinking about what would I want to talk about. God, there's all kinds of things and stories I could tell you. But I think one of the things, since the museum is all about history, I thought maybe I would go through the history of presidential airplanes. And why is the airplane addressed as Air Force One? Because not too many people understand that. First of all, the first president that ever flew in an airplane was Theodore Roosevelt. He flew with the Wright brothers. He was out of office at the time. So President Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to actually fly. And he went to Malta with Pan American China Clipper to meet with Churchill and Stalin in the meeting. Now, the first dedicated airplane for the president was a B-24 bomber that had been converted. But the Secret Service didn't consider it as a safe airplane, and they wouldn't let him fly on it. Mrs. Roosevelt, however, did fly on it a couple of times. So they came up with a DC-4, or C-54, and they modified it specifically for President Roosevelt because he was wheelchair bound, and they had an elevator so that he could wheel his wheelchair into the elevator and go straight up into the cabin. And that airplane was called Sacred Cow, and Captain Williams, or Colonel Williams, was a pilot of that. When President Roosevelt retired, or died, and Truman became president, then he used that airplane for a period of time until he got a DC-6 or a C-118, and he named it the Independence, which was after the city of Independence, Missouri. And Colonel Myers was the pilot of that. Then when General Eisenhower was Supreme Commander in Europe, he was assigned with a Lockheed Constellation and his pilot, Colonel Draper. So when he became president, he was familiar with and liked the Connie, and as it turned out, there were 6 Connies in the Special Air Mission Fleet. So they selected the one that had the tail number 8610. Now, up to this time, the aircraft call signs was Air Force, or Air Corps, or Army. So there was a flight over Philadelphia, and there was an Eastern 8610, and then there's an Air Force 8610, and there was an air traffic control clearance given to them, and there was some confusion about who was it for. So when Colonel Draper got on the ground, he went with the FAA and says, we've got to do something so that we can designate that the president's on board the airplane. So that's where they came up with the term Air Force One. Now, Air Force only says that it's an Air Force airplane with the president on board. If it was a Navy airplane, it's Navy One. And if you see now the Marines flying the helicopter, that's Marine One. If the Vice President's on board, then it becomes Air Force Two. And if you fly the first family, they call it Executive One Foxtrot, letting the people know that a family of the first family is on board. And if they were the president were fly on a civilian airplane, as President Nixon did that one time when he flew on United out to LA, it's Executive One. So that's where the Air Force One started. It's not an airplane. It's any airplane that the president's on board would be called Air Force or Navy or whatever. Now, during the administration of President Eisenhower, Air Force bought 3 707s, and they had a different kind of a paint job. It wasn't very attractive. They called it Big Bow. It was an orange nose painted on the thing, and U.S. Air Force across the top of the fuselage. And when President Kennedy became president, he was not satisfied that it didn't represent the United States well enough. So he got with his wife Jackie and a man by the name of Lowry, who was the designer, and that's where they came up with that gorgeous two-tone blue and a white top with the American flag on the vertical stabilizer, and across the top it said United States of America. So that's where that paint job came from. The airplane that I flew primarily at that time was tail number 26000. Now that airplane has some history to it because that was the airplane that Colonel Swindle flew President Nixon's body back to Washington in. It's the airplane we took to China. It's the airplane we took to Russia. And it was also the airplane that we secretly flew Henry Kissinger into Paris for his secret talks with the Vietnamese. So it's got a lot of history to it. So anyway, that's a brief breakdown on as far as the location of these airplanes now. The first airplane to be called Air Force One was that 610 at Connie. Unfortunately, that airplane is in no museum. And there's a group of people, well, first of all, when it left service, some rancher bought it for crop dusting. I can't imagine using a Connie for crop dusting, but supposedly that's what he did. Well, somebody's bought that thing and they're rebuilding it to put it in a museum. As far as the location of these airplanes now, the Sacred Cow, the Independence, the 26000 are all in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Columbine 2, which was the Super Connie that President Eisenhower's in that museum. 27000, which was the one that Nixon, when he resigned, was flying, as well as Reagan. That's in the Reagan Library down in Simi Valley. The 970, which is our backup plane, that's in Seattle in the Boeing Museum up there. There was a C-118 3240 that President Kennedy used to use to go up to Hannah.